Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Tommy Wood. He's a neuroscientist, performance coach, and assistant professor at the University of Washington. He's worked with everyone from newborns and brain injuries to world champion athletes, and his research explores how we can optimize brain health, performance, and longevity through lifestyle and physiology. So, Tommy, thank you for coming on, man. Appreciate you taking time out of your day.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I paid attention to your stuff for quite a while now. I think first time I came across you, were you on the Revive Stronger podcast at one point?
Yes, I was on with my friend and colleague Ben House. We did an episode together on that podcast. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I thought that's where. And then Dr. Mike Nelson stuff as well too. And then I've seen you all over the place, but those are like kind of the main ones there. So
Yeah,
you're looking.
Dr. Mike is my coach. He does all my programming, so he's a very good friend of mine.
That's right. I did see him post that because you just recently did a strongman, right? Competition.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that do you do those often or?
Since COVID, I've done about one a year. That was when I started training for strongman, just to like try something different. So I've done like 5 or 6 shows now.
Cool. Is that kind of your background, is like kind of strength, or what does that kind of look like in terms of like training and stuff like that?
So my background back in the day started actually more with endurance. So I was a rower in college and in medical school, and then I tried my hand at some ultra endurance stuff. I did some like multiple marathons in multiple days. I did the world's first ever fully off-road Ironman triathlon back in 2012. But I'm 6'2" and 220 pounds, so I'm not like I'm not built like an endurance athlete. So I've did a bit of powerlifting, done some CrossFit, all those things, and then tried my hand at strongman most recently.
I was gonna say, I mean, you're pretty jacked, I feel like. So,
Thanks.
but when you said you did endurance, I was like, okay, that's interesting. So have you always kind of had that build, or is that something that since you've kind of transitioned more to like weight training and stuff like that, you kind of built that up, or yeah, what did that kind of look like?
Yeah, I used to weigh when I was a rower, and especially when I was doing the endurance stuff, I obviously weighed sort of like 20, 30 pounds less. And then yeah, the rest has sort of come on. But like in between, I always did like bodybuilding style training, even though it probably didn't help my rowing or any of my other stuff. I just like couldn't quite allow myself to get down to that really lean endurance physique. But I was never competing to be the best in the world. I was just doing it because I enjoyed it. And then actually when I moved to the US, actually when I started my PhD maybe 10 years ago, I sort of more started to focus on more kind of strength type stuff, and so then I guess I've put on 20 pounds or so in the last 10 years.
Awesome. Was it hard to kind of balance the like resistance training and the cardio when you were doing that? Or was that just, again, whenever you had the spare time, you were kind of lifting some weights? And like you said, it didn't necessarily probably help your endurance performance, but like you said, you always kind of had that itch for it. So
Yeah, that's exactly it. So like before and after long training sessions, I go and do some bicep curls or something. That was basically how that looked, and then it essentially flipped the other way around. Well, so I was doing CrossFit when I was working as a doctor in London, but that was pretty brutal actually. I'd get up at 5 in the morning to go do CrossFit, and then I'd do night shifts and stuff. So I was like not sleeping, and it was like hard to recover. So later on, I figured out a kind of a better balance of the two. And then it wasn't until I worked with Dr. Mike, he made me start doing cardio again. I kind of didn't do any cardio for 7 or 8 years, and then he convinced me that was probably a good idea, which actually does help a lot because when I compete in strongman, like I'm not the strongest guy there. Like the static stuff, overhead pressing, deadlifts, like I do okay, but where I can make up ground is in like the endurance, like medleys, truck pulls, like that kind of stuff. I've got a better engine than the other guys, so that's where I usually make up some ground.
well, and I feel like too, I would imagine, I would imagine a lot of people in that kind of sport don't do really much cardiovascular training. Again, I'm making a
Yeah.
generalization here. I'm sure there's obviously some people that do, but I would imagine most people don't. And like you said, I mean, there's obviously the specifics of the medleys where that's going to come into play. But I mean, even from like a recovery standpoint, though, I mean, I got to imagine that you're going to have an upper hand there with that if you are doing your conditioning and cardiovascular training.
I think so, and that's like historically where I trained a bunch. But I think I recover pretty well between events, and that definitely helps because you're sort of doing an event every hour, every 90 minutes for a full day. It ends up being quite a lot. So yeah, that can help too.
What did your training kind of look like leading up to it? Like, what was that kind of split of like cardiovascular training and
Mm.
strongman stuff?
So my split is pretty much, it stays the same pretty much year out. Like Monday is some kind of deadlift day, and that will be tinkered to whatever kind of deadlift there's going to be at my next competition. It would just be regular deadlifts or trap bar deadlifts like throughout the off season, but then usually there's a deadlift of some kind in the show. So in the last show I did, it was like high handle trap bar deadlift, like an 18-inch pick height. So I was doing those, and then I decided to do another one in a couple of weeks' time, and that's actually a deficit deadlift. So it's exactly the opposite, and I now have to work at that end. So that's Monday with some like accessory work. Tuesdays is just some sort of like low level zone 2/3 cardio. So that's Tuesday. Wednesday is like sort of push pull, some kind of bench press, rows, that kind of thing. A bit of arm work. Thursday is cardio again. Friday is usually some kind of rowing sprint. So in that kind of 60 second to 2 minute range, because that's where the medleys are. So it's usually some repeats of something awful on the rowing machine, like max effort, plus maybe a little bit of specific work for if there's some kind of event, maybe some event work. So it could be sandbags or logs or something like that. And then Saturday is usually like a squat kind of day. That's generally how things pan out.
So it sounds like you're doing like 3 kind of conditioning days in that program typically throughout the week.
Yeah, so three mainly conditioning days, 3 mainly lift days. Yeah.
What's out of all those days for you? What is the most challenging and like most demanding?
Either deadlift day or like rowing sprint day. Yeah, those are generally the two worst.
I was going to ask, I would imagine that would be, when I asked that question, I thought you were going to say maybe the sprinting on the rows. I would imagine it was pretty taxing on the body. Is it pretty high volume for that, or is it just kind of like a couple rounds, or what? Does it just depend on?
Yeah, Mike makes the mistake of saying like 2 to 3 rounds, and I'll always do 2. So I used to be a rower. I can push myself pretty hard on the rowing machine. So like after 2 like 60-second or 500-meter sprints, like I'm toast. That's plenty.
So your outputs there basically is what you're saying. You're super efficient with the movement and everything like that, so you can get the most out of it. Whereas most people, they don't have that kind of skill development of the rower.
Yeah.
Do you do the rower on your like kind of zone 2, zone 3 days as well too?
No, mainly because I spent so much time doing that in the past that I hate it. So I'll usually do like hill walks or rucks on a treadmill. I got a treadmill in the gym, so that's usually what I do.
Cool. And then what was I know you kind of had to do a weight cut and water cut for this. What does that typically look like? Is that something that you will just kind of stay within range of the weight that you need to be at most of the like leading up to the competition, or what does that kind of process look like?
So yeah, this one was my second weight cut or water cut to kind of get underweight to get into the 90 kilo class. So normally like throughout the year I'll hang out around kind of 250. 2 or 3 months out I'll just like go into a slight deficit to try and get sort of under 210. And then the last week I'll do a water cut. So I'll like salt load and water load, and then completely eliminate salt for the last 2 days, and then water for the last 24 hours. And essentially you like pee out 10 pounds in one night. It still amazes me how that works. And yeah, that will then get me under, and then you have 24 hours to sort of rehydrate. That's
insane. So you get down to about 210 pounds, right? And then that's when you do that water cut to what?
One is 198. So maybe if I can, I'll usually try and get down to 207, 208. That makes it easier. And then so I also for the last couple of days I cut carbs and fiber and things just to try and any extra bulk or water with glycogen that sort of helps get rid of that. But yeah, I can usually drop sort of 10, 12 pounds in a week.
That's insane that you can, like, if people hear that and they think that that's not possible, but it's crazy how much like water weight and stuff like that really can, how much you can change in just a short amount of time.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not good for your performance. Like, don't get me wrong. And it's maybe not the best for your health either, but I enjoy doing it because it's interesting from a physiological standpoint, like be able to manipulate your physiology in that way. But also like I work with athletes who have to do this kind of thing. So I think it's useful for me to have that experience firsthand.
What are some things that you can do? Like you said, in general, likely not the greatest from a performance standpoint, and then obviously from an overall health standpoint, but like, what are some things that you can do to kind of minimize that?
Yes. So I think, the more you can do the rest of the time, right? This is 1 week of my life where maybe I consume a lot more salt than I probably should. Like I can almost when you do the salt load at the beginning, it's like I can feel like my blood vessels are like packed to the limit. So my blood
Yeah.
pressure is probably higher than it normally is. You gotta you feel full. But the rest of the time, obviously, still maintain a focus on cardiovascular health. I eat pretty well. I sleep pretty well. I, do a whole. There are some other things that kind of help from a cardiovascular health standpoint. So I think like sauna can help with that. I have a sauna at home. So I make sure that my ducks are in a row the other 51 weeks of the year, and then I feel a little more confident that I can sort of push things for a week or two if I need to.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, what you do most of the time is going to be really the big factor there.
Yeah.
With that. But, again, I could see, I mean, performance, I would imagine, obviously it's set up in the way that, with you being able to have, you said, 24 hours to kind of refuel and everything like that. I mean, do you feel like that still impacts performance, you think, or do you?
Yeah, even though I think I do a pretty good job rehydrating and like all the weight is back on the next day, I still have to be kind of careful with my fluids and electrolytes on like during the competition. Like I've noticed if I don't quite get enough electrolytes or fluids in, like I can cramp a little bit more easily. I definitely still feel a little dehydrated during the day, even if I'm continuously drinking. And I think it's just because the body is kind of trying to catch up in terms of all the different hormones that regulate fluid balance. So yeah, there's some potential trade-offs, but the alternative is that I compete in the 105 kilo class and get my butt kicked and like zero half the events because like I'm not strong enough. I think that's kind of the trade-off I have to make.
Yeah. And I mean, you probably don't want to cut too much weight in that, period leading up too, because that's obviously going to probably have a, just a bit like a impact on your performance as well too, in terms of what you can do there. So you kind of keeping that a bit more moderate on the way down.
One thing I've noticed is that, and I think this is a mistake that some people make, is you try and cut really far out from a calorie standpoint, whereas it's much easier, and actually particularly with strength, that if you sort of if I have to drop like 5-6 pounds to sort of get close before the water cut, if I do that 2 or 3 months out, I can regain all the strength that I had at that lower weight. The body just has to adapt. Whereas if I try to do it all in a really short period of time, then I'm more likely to negatively impact performance.
So are you saying there that you would rather gradually lose it, give yourself a little bit of time at that body weight to kind of regain everything versus try and do it super quick and everything like that?
Yeah. So try and if you get into like a massive calorie deficit 2-3 weeks out, I think you're going to see a bigger hit in performance. Whereas if you get down to lose that extra weight 2 or 3 months out, you can restabilize and then just lose that last bit with the water cut.
I think the research too kind of shows that, right? Where like strength is a little bit easier to maintain when you are in like a more moderate deficit than like, hypertrophy can start to get impacted and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. No, that's super interesting stuff. I don't think I had a buddy that competed in strongman. I went to a couple competitions and those are super interesting. It was always fun to kind of watch those. It was a lot different. The training always, to me, I don't know, like it sounds like yours is again, kind of like you're doing deadlift stuff like that. But like the training always seemed like a pain in the ass because you would always like have to get like out all this stuff. And I'm like, man, that seems like half the workouts, just getting out all the equipment that you need for the training.
My wife often jokes that she knows I've signed up for a strongman show when something shows up at the door, like I've ordered a keg or a log or more sandbags. She's like, oh, okay, when are you competing next? Yeah, so I've over the years I've accumulated a lot of toys in the gym.
That's hilarious. A cake shows up at the house. She knows. Yeah. Tommy's not trying to drink a bunch of beer. He's getting ready for the competition. I love it.
He's gonna fill it with sand and throw it around. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm curious to hear about your kind of background in like in this field and industry and stuff. Kind of how you got to where you're at today.
Sure. So I basically wear two main hats. The first is as I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington. I run a basic neuroscience lab. We try and find ways to either treat or prevent a brain injury in a variety of scenarios. So like you mentioned right at the beginning of birth, so brain injury in babies, but we also work in traumatic brain injury and concussions in adults, and more in sort of dementia, cognitive decline, or at least maintaining cognitive function late into life, because all of those different things actually influence one another to kind of create this trajectory of cognitive function across your life. And we try and work in all those different areas as much as we can. So that kind of started, like I mentioned, I went to medical school. Then before I sort of specialized, I didn't know quite what I wanted to do. So I did a PhD in neuroscience that kind of then led me more down the academic track. And that's kind of the bulk of my day job. On the side of that, like I've mentioned, I was an athlete myself, and then I was a coach for athletes. So I was head coach of the medical school rowing club when I was there at Oxford. And then during my PhD, I helped build a company that worked with athletes on various aspects of health and performance, sleep, nutrition, blood tests, all that kind of stuff. And that's something that I still do. So I mentioned Ben House earlier. We were on the Revive Stronger podcast. He and I have done a ton of stuff on interpreting blood tests for athletes. And I do some performance consulting with various elite athletes, and professional athletes, but mainly right now in Formula One, so which I do through a company called Hints of Performance. So basically, I get to just do all the things that I find fun and interesting. It's a real privilege to be able to kind of dabble in all those different areas and have a job that allows me to do that, and then kind of find ways to tie all these things together. And I think 5 years ago, some people might look at my CV and be like, "This just doesn't make any sense. Like, how do all these pieces fit together?" But I think there are so many aspects of all of those that kind of require, right? The brain requires a certain set of parameters and things in order to function at its best or recover or develop. And actually those things are very similar. So I'm increasingly trying to tie all these parts together, from like elite cognitive function and cognitive performance through to brain injury, protection and recovery.
So with Formula One, what does that kind of typically look like in that? Is it like, I think you said you work on like the cognitive side of things with them. Like, this may be a dumb question, but is there like physical training too that you have to do with, or yeah, what does that kind of look like?
Yes. So my job title has changed a little bit over the years. Like right now, I think I can call myself head of science for motorsport for this company, Hints of Performance, which works with approximately half the Formula One drivers in any given year. Sometimes it's a bit more, sometimes it's a bit less. And Hints does two things. It provides medical support. So there's doctors who go to every race. They support all the teams as well as the drivers. So that, that's the mechanics, the engineers, like all the other staff and the strategy people, right? They travel a bunch, they get sick. Obviously, there's, injuries and other things that can happen. So there's a medical team that I work with, particularly on the blood test side. So looking at blood tests from a sort of nutrition performance standpoint for the drivers. And then they also provide coaches. So almost every driver that works with us has a coach who is sort of centrally provided by us. So I help with some of the continuing education for coaches, doing talks on sleep, nutrition, all these other things, new tech, cognitive training and cognitive testing. And then that coach is kind of responsible for the performance of their driver, and they're there like every day. And they might be making protein shakes, they might be, doing the food, they might be tracking the sleep, they're writing the training program. They're collecting data, and these coaches are, they usually have a master's degree in some kind of sports science. Many of them either have PhDs or they're working on PhDs, and my job is kind of to support them. So they might have questions about physiology, technology. So my main goal is just sort of be a resource for everything in that sort of performance related world.
Awesome. So it sounds like you're not working with any driver specifically. You kind of work with the coaches that work with the driver specifically and kind of overlook that.
Yeah, so I'll go to 1 or 2 races a year. I'll often meet with drivers then. They have access to me throughout the year if they want. Different drivers have different levels of support. So some I work with more closely than others. But a lot of my role is to really sort of oversee and support the people who are right there on a day-to-day basis.
What does training kind of look like for a F1 driver?
They have to have a really good mix of strength and endurance. So some previous people that I worked with at the company actually compared fitness of Formula One drivers to other motorsports drivers, so like NASCAR and IndyCar. They tend to have like a higher VO2 max. They tend to be fitter. The races are either longer or more physically demanding. So these guys often do a lot of running, biking, just to kind of build that aerobic base, as well as some interval work where needed. But then they have to work on, very specific aspects of strength. Neck strength is super important, when you're going through corners, 200 miles an hour, multiple Gs, being able to control your head is really important. So they work on very sort of specific strength aspects as well. A lot of this has to happen in the off season, because once you're on the road in the season, they're in a different country every week. Sometimes often on the road, it can be more difficult to have a very consistent routine. So that's really then between the coach and the driver to figure out how do we build and then maintain these adaptations in a way that works for them. And, we each have their own strengths and weaknesses and different things that they have to work on. But broadly, they need to be pretty, aerobically fit and have quite a lot of static strength as well as other aspects of more dynamic strength to be able to drive the car.
It's interesting because like years ago, I would have been like, they don't really need to have any sort of fitness, right? Like you just need to know how to drive a car. But it's crazy to think that, you need to have kind of those fitness characteristics of that. Is the VO2 max and the conditioning, is that just again, I've never driven a car like that. I don't know much about this at all. Is it just the ability to like to be able to do that for multiple hours? Is it the cognitive side of things as well too that kind of goes into that? Or
yeah, so this is it is very physically demanding. That the heart rate is sort of 120, 150 or higher for prolonged periods throughout the race. It's often also a heat stressed environment. So they just had a race in Singapore. It's 60 degrees Celsius in the cockpit. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's hot, as well as being super humid. So these guys might lose a gallon of fluid, right? They might lose 7 or 8, right? That water cut I did in a week, they might lose that in a race.
That's insane.
When it's really hot. So then the fitter you are, the better you are able to handle those kinds of physical challenges and then have cognitive capacity on top. So, because we know once you become physically fatigued, your cognitive function declines. So the best drivers are the ones who are able to handle those physically demanding conditions, which requires you to be both fit and strong, so that they can then have cognitive capacity to drive the car, think about strategy, navigate all the other cars around them. So that's, you might think, yes, if it was just you alone on the track, you probably don't need the same level of physical fitness. But when you're trying to layer all those things on top of each other, the more physical capacity you have, the more cognitive, headroom, I call it, you then have to be able to do all the difficult stuff during the race.
And that's insane. So I looked it up. It's 100. Does that sound right? 140 degrees Fahrenheit?
Yeah, that's about right. In the cockpit, yeah.
That's basically like sitting in a sauna for multiple
hours. For 2 hours. It's in Singapore, it's 80+% humidity or something, right? So it's not just a sauna. It's a sauna where you've poured water on the rocks and it's super steamy at the same time.
I definitely see the cognitive side of things. And I obviously say that like I understand the physical fitness side of things as well too. But then you mentioned all those things. I don't know if you said this or not, but on top of it, you're also driving a car at like crazy speeds as well too, to top it off. Yeah, that's really cool. And then from like a supplement standpoint, is there anything that like you guys kind of recommend for them?
Do you know what? It's really personalized. There's a few limitations. It's a drug tested sport. So anything that they can take whatever they want, but anything that I can recommend has to come from a third-party tested program. So it has to be NSF for sport or Informed Sport certified, so that it doesn't have banned substances. That limits the number of things that you can kind of recommend. But then it just depends on the individual. Are they having issues? They might be having issues with sleep. They might be having issues with stress, right? These are normal human beings in stressful environments. Or there might be some things they might take before they get in the car to sort of increase arousal or manage arousal. You can sort of overdo it too. I think every driver and every coach has a story of a time when they had too much caffeine before they got in the car and then they just got too amped up and stacked it in the wall. So some of this stuff is a real fine balance of trying to find what works for the individual.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, very, very individualized to what they need. And like you said, even caffeine, you can overdo the caffeine. And I would imagine driving a car super fast, that's probably not the greatest combination there either. So,
well, there's this really interesting balance of like where you need to be in terms of arousal for performance. It's the same for every sport, but I think it's easy to describe it in Formula One because you can, for a very simple cognitive task like reaction time, basically up to, unless you're taking huge amounts, more caffeine is better, right? The faster your reaction time will be. But that's just the reaction time will help you get off the line fast. But if you're then over amped up, that's when you're then having to navigate the first corner and you're traveling at 150 miles an hour and there's 19 cars around you all trying to do the same thing at the same time. That's when you actually need to be less amped up because otherwise you don't necessarily have the full kind of perception of everything that's going on. So that's why it's a really fine balance. You can get off the line really quickly, but then you have to navigate the next set of corners without crashing.
I would imagine though that dosing for caffeine for that would be super challenging just because it's like there's got to be a lot of factors that go into it, right? From like obviously the person, how they metabolize caffeine to what they've had to eat. Like I would imagine it's super challenging to find that right dose. So I don't know if there's like any safe kind of measures that you guys take for that or what that looks like.
It's a lot of it is still a bit of trial and error. They have other, every week or every race, there are multiple practice sessions, plus then there's a qualifying session and then the race. Sometimes there's an additional qualifying and shorter race if it's a sprint race weekend. So you have multiple opportunities to try things out. And obviously over time, you accumulate some of this knowledge. So yes, you kind of need to get the right-ish dose at the right kind of time. And like some like coffee, some avoid it. Some would prefer to take, a supplement that has caffeine in it. Some, some might use something like green tea, right? You have some theanine, which can balance some of those effects. There are some other interesting things like there isn't a good supplement that's third-party tested for it, but there's a coffee that has where they've swapped out the caffeine for paraxanthine, and paraxanthine has some of the same like arousing effects of caffeine, but maybe doesn't. It's a little bit more predictable in terms of its effects and has a shorter half-life. So I know a couple of drivers who've played around with that. It's really just a case of some trial and error and knowing your body.
Well, and then on top of it, from my understanding, if someone does like coffee, it's like how it's brewed and like different coffees. Well, it's not consistent in terms of how much caffeine's in there either. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there is you don't have to get exactly 50 milligrams, right? You have a little bit of a window, but the difference between 50 and 150 could be pretty big.
Yep. I know I've been there where I've taken too much caffeine, and that does not feel good to have too much caffeine in there. Just balance it out with more L-theanine, right? Like that's all you got to do.
That's well, if you can, that's one approach that does work for some people, but yeah, it depends.
Yeah, I did recently start taking L-theanine. I really do. I think it's great there, especially for someone who does like coffee. So cool. Well, I wanted to talk to you about your book that's coming out. I think I just looked last night. February, is that kind of when you're looking to have it out at this point?
March 24th, it comes out in the US.
March. Okay, March. Sorry. And it's called The Stimulated Mind: Future-Proof Your Brain from Dementia and Stay Sharp at Any Age. I think that this is super important. I know you kind of talk about it in there about how, a lot of people don't really think about people want to get in better shape. They want to build, they want to build more muscle, build strength, but people don't really they don't try and build their brain either at the same time. Right. And it's like, that's, one of the most important things that you can do, because I think, when we look at people, you see people they're older or maybe not even that old, having dementia. And like, that's one of the scariest things I feel like you could see is your brain not working. And I just feel like people don't really understand the impact of that. So I'm just curious, just talk about your book a little bit, a little intro to it. And then I have some specific questions around it.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, like you said, it's called The Stimulated Mind. It's essentially, the whole book builds together into this model that I have for the different things that the brain requires in order to first develop and then maintain function. And this, because of my interest in physical performance, a lot of it relates, and I think. When you actually look at the mechanisms and the neuroscience, it relates quite nicely to, or it was very similar to how we might talk about physical performance, cognitive performance, and how the brain responds to stimulus. Hence, the stimulated mind is actually very similar. In several parts, in parts of it, I mention how the function of the brain is essentially driven by how we use it. And you can kind of relate this to some kind of physical feat as well. So if you want to have bigger biceps, right? You want to get bigger, you want to get stronger. The most important thing is to go to the gym and lift weights, right? Some kind of mechanical tension against your skeletal muscle. You can then maximize the response to that with better nutrition, more sleep, right? Reducing stress, all these other things. We already talked about cardiovascular fitness, right? That's important for recovery from exercise, but also may help you to do more work in a given session, right? So you can then get greater adaptation. But really, the most important thing is that stimulus that your brain or your body receives. That's kind of where this idea comes from, and then essentially lays out all the different tactics that we can use in different areas of lifestyle in order to improve cognitive function and then maintain it long term. Like you mentioned, I think one of the reasons why people don't really think about their brains, one is that it's just this sort of like mystery that we can't see, right? I can see my biceps in the mirror. I know when my bicep curls have done the job. But The brain is much more of a mystery, and in reality, I think it will remain that way. I kind of make the case in the book that we will probably never fully understand the brain, but that's okay because we understand enough about what the brain needs in order to improve its function. But something else that people don't really realize, and we sort of tend to maybe ignore because it is a very scary thought. But nowadays, most people will agree that probably the majority of dementia is preventable. Right. So dementia is the formal term for when somebody's cognitive function has declined to a point where they can no longer essentially look after themselves on a day-to-day basis. And there are lots of different ways of looking at this, but various papers now suggest that somewhere between 40 and 70% of dementia is preventable, and at least half of that is due to lifestyle and environmental factors that we have direct control over. So that doesn't mean that any one case of dementia can definitely be prevented, right? It's very common, it's still very complex, but there are all these things we can do to stack the decks in our favor. That improves our cognitive function today, but it can also dramatically decrease our risk of dementia long term. And I think once people realize that, they can then start to engage in the process of doing something about it. Because before, people might think, well, there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just going to ignore it and not think about it. Whereas I think there's a lot we can do. And if you're somebody who listens to this podcast, you're probably doing some of the things that are going to protect your brain long term, like building and maintaining muscle mass and strength is really critical for certain aspects of cognitive function and brain structure. And then there's a whole other bunch of things that we can stack on top of that.
So it sounds like, for a lot of people, again, that like we said, they don't really think about how they can build their brain like their body. But then also a lot of people kind of have that thought that this is just what happens, right? Like, hey, you get old and you just kind of lose function. And then that eventually you get dementia, and that's just kind of how it is. From my understanding, and what you're saying here is we obviously can control that by the things. And a lot of, again, when people get dementia, a lot of it is something that we can do about it ahead of time or earlier versus, hey, it's just kind of a part of life. And again, I do feel like that's just people like, oh, yeah, just kind of got it. I would imagine, though, that for some people, there's like genetics and certain predispositions that will obviously put them at a higher risk. And so for those people, it's like they probably just need to pay attention more to these things specifically.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make. So yes, genetics play a role. There are individual genes, right? So people might have heard of the ApoE4 genotype. So apolipoprotein E, you have two copies, and those copies can either be ApoE2, 3, or 4. If you have at least one copy of ApoE4, you have an increased risk of dementia and an even greater risk if you have two copies. There are also like polygenic risks. So you can do something called a polygenic risk score, which basically says across thousands of genes, they sort of add up in small amounts to increase or decrease your risk of dementia. And, a simpler way to think about that might be your family history. If you have a family history of dementia, then you're more likely to get dementia yourself. In each of those cases, the same interventions, you're making sure that you take care of diet, lifestyle, and the environment as much as you can, you mitigate a lot of that increased risk. So yes, genetics plays a big role, but ApoE4 as being the example, most of the evidence suggests that it's a risk multiplier, not like a fixed risk factor. So if you have ApoE4 and you're sedentary and you eat a low quality diet and you drink alcohol and you smoke, that amplifies the risk associated with those things. But if that isn't the case and you're physically active and you eat and you sleep and all those things, you can probably offset the vast majority, if not all, of the risk that comes with having ApoE4. So yes, those people who are at higher risk, it would help them to pay more attention, but that doesn't mean that they can't do anything about it.
Is that something that you recommend everybody get tested for, or what is that? Or is it just like kind of, again, if you have maybe family history of that, like that would be something, or is there anything specific there?
Yeah, there's been a lot of debate on that, and it's a good question. So some people will say, I want to know everything, and I want to know how much risk I'm at, because then I know what to do about it, or I'm prepared. Others will say, I don't want to know, because if I do know, I'm just going to be more stressed about it. And right, that stress of knowing about it is just that the stress is going to be maybe worse than the effect of the risk itself. So that's really individual. Then the important takeaway is that it doesn't matter if you know your risk or not, because the same things are going to be important, right? So if you're somebody who's sedentary or has low muscle mass or doesn't sleep well, that's something that you should fix regardless of your genetics. right? So in many cases, having that information about genetics doesn't change what you'd actually do. So then you can just decide whether or not you want to know, or if you just want to focus on the things that you can actually change.
That's a good point, right? Because as you're saying, that's like, yeah, it makes sense. Even if you are like at the end of the day, what you actually do is going to be the most important, right? I feel like it's a lot with like building muscle. People want to know certain, but it's like again, what you actually do. Like people want to know like how much muscle they have. It's like, but again, what you actually do is going to be the most important, right? Like you
Yeah,
need to do the things in order to get there, and it's kind of the same thing. It sounds like with this, like you could get it done, but and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but stress is something that could like make things worse long term. And if you're
absolutely.
stressing about that number, that's obviously going to be a net negative there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, maybe what we can then talk about is like what are some of these things? Like obviously, I feel like people, like you said, that listen to this, they're probably weight training, they're probably doing some cardio. But I'm just curious in terms of that, like how much would we need to do specifically there to help maximize that or to help with that?
Yes. So the answer probably is not that much. And when you think about what the general population does, it doesn't take a lot necessarily to see significant benefits, compared to sort of like the baseline average population in, like high income countries like the US or the UK, most places in Europe, for instance. So one way to look at this, and this is a group that I mention in my book, is what we call super agers. And they've gotten a lot of attention recently. There was even a book, Eric Topol had a book called Super Agers. But this is a group whose cognitive function in their 80s is the same as it was in their 50s, right? So very stable cognitive function for decades, late into life. And if you look at what super agers do, it's not that much. They just, they avoid diabetes and other, chronic health conditions, heart disease, things like that, by being overall sort of metabolically healthy and cardiovascularly fit. And by that, I mean, they just don't have chronic disease. They do enough to just prevent that. There's no like optimization. They don't need their VO2 max to be 70 or anything like that. They just need to be fit enough to avoid diabetes and significant heart disease. They maintain some kind of social connection. They do some kind of, ideally several cognitively stimulating activities, right? They're parts of groups. They volunteer. They have hobbies, and they sleep relatively well, 6-7 hours a night. That's it. And the main thing that we don't realize is that most people don't do that. As you get older, health declines, physical activity declines, social connections decline. We stop engaging in cognitively stimulating things. Like in general, most cognitive stimulation comes from our work. Retirement is then a significant period of risk. And in many studies, they suggest that the largest drop off in cognitive function is actually right after retirement, because we stop receiving that stimulus to the brain that we get from our work. So in reality, one of the things that I talk about that we need as we get older is resolve, right? We just need to keep engaging in these things, and that's often enough to dramatically decrease risk. We can sort of delve into each of those different buckets, but in reality, if you're sort of in the top third of the population in all those different areas, that's probably enough. You will see a dramatic decrease in risk just by maintaining enough in those different areas.
Yeah, no, like you said, you don't necessarily need to do, like you said, you don't need a VO2 max of 70. Again, I would like to talk about like, is there maybe some benefit of continuing to improve that if there's anything, but like you said, you don't need anything crazy. Social connection is going to be super important. Like you said, the one that really stood out is the cognitive demanding tasks, right? Like doing things like that regularly. I could imagine where a lot of people do, as you said, once they retire, they probably lack that a lot. I know just from an anecdote, like my wife's grandpa, like during COVID, he was already, I think in his like late 80s, he wasn't able to go out and like hang with his friends like he was, and he was stuck inside. I mean, his health just kind of went down like super quick, brain health. So it's crazy to see how, I'm sure that happened to a lot of people in that time frame.
Yeah, so like I kind of said, I think that input the brain receives is the primary driver of how our brains function. And everybody has a story of one person, if not multiple people, who, as soon as they retired or as soon as they weren't, maybe they lost some physical function, they weren't able to go out and interact with people, that's when cognitive function really starts to decline. And just like with, say, cardiovascular fitness, just like with physical strength, muscle quality, when you stimulate a tissue, that starts the processes of tissue maintenance in addition to like repair and increasing function. So if we think about some of the hallmarks of aging, one of the things that people talk about a lot is autophagy. If you talk about longevity, you're talking about autophagy, which is the body kind of cleaning up junky proteins and organelles and this kind of thing to maintain function. The best way to stimulate autophagy is to stimulate a tissue. So people fast for autophagy, but you get much faster autophagy if you do exercise, because that creates this metabolic demand that then tells the tissue, hey, I need to improve my function, right? Because there's this metabolic demand being placed on me. You see that in muscle tissue, and you also see that in the brain. So the way to maintain function is to continue to stimulate functions and networks within the brain by engaging with stuff. Then I guess a good place to go is to talk about this model that I have for the brain, which is sort of the penultimate chapter in the book. So I have 3 buckets. I call it the 3S model. The first is stimulus, and that is all the different things that we can do to challenge our brain. So it's learning new skills, languages, instruments, social connection, complex motor skills, open skill sports, which require you to either interact with other people or react to the environment. They use more motor patterns. They use more muscle groups. Badminton, table tennis, dancing, surfing, those kinds of things, where you're reacting, responding to the environment. That seems to be a greater stimulus for cognitive function above and beyond, like, say, running at the same intensity. So those are the things that we can do to kind of stimulate our brains. And then in order to respond to that stimulus, the brain needs a supply. So that's my second S of a few things. So one is a good supply of oxygen. Right, so you need a healthy cardiovascular system. That's where cardiovascular fitness becomes important. You also need a steady supply of energy. That's where metabolic health becomes really important, avoiding type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, metabolic syndrome. And then you need a supply of nutrients in order to build and maintain the synapses and organelles in the brain. So there are lots of nutrients the brain needs, but like some really big ones are B vitamins, omega-3s, iron, vitamin D. You can then get down to things like magnesium, polyphenols in the diet seem to help sort of regulate a lot of these processes. But that's sort of like the supply bucket. And then you need support. So you need allow the brain to adapt to this stimulus. That's when you build new networks. That's when you build new synapses. That's when neuroplasticity happens. So a lot of that happens during sleep. So sleep is critical. But then you want to avoid things that interfere with that process. So chronic stress, you mentioned, is one, but then smoking, alcohol, air pollution, all these other things can then sort of interfere with that adaptation process as well. So like those are the 3 buckets, stimulus, supply, and support. And I think not many people, or not enough people think about the stimulus portion, but if you do a very complex and demanding job, or you're a student, right, you're already stimulating your brain a bunch. So then, maybe it's one of the other buckets where you need to focus, but all of these things kind of interact. So if you stimulate your brain more, you sleep more and you sleep better. If you stimulate your brain more, then that draws in the nutrients and blood supply that it needs in order to adapt. So all of these things kind of interact.
And so it sounds like, obviously, if one is like, obviously, again, it sounds like it's training, right? Like in order to develop your brain, like you need to provide the stimulus, right? Like you can't build muscle without the stimulus. So you need that. But I would imagine same thing, like you said, if you want to kind of make those processes better and amplify them, you need to make sure like you are, again, like you said, sleeping well, stress is regulated, but then the nutrition side of things is also super important as well. And that's going to amplify it, make it more effective and efficient, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. But what's interesting as well, I don't think about all these different factors as a list. Like often you'll see, you're on Instagram, it's like, here's 15 things to keep your brain healthy. And as somebody who you look at that list and you're like, well, that's a lot of stuff. I'm just not going to do anything. Right? And when you think about 15 things you have to do, you do 0 things. That's just normal human behavior change. But what people don't realize is that because this is an interconnected network that all kind of works together, is when you change one thing, right, you change a whole bunch of other stuff. When you focus on sleep, systemic inflammation decreases and metabolic health probably improves if you've been chronically sleep deprived. You feel more sociable. So you're more likely to socially interact with other people. You're more likely to engage in healthier eating behaviors, improving your movement behaviors. You improve your cardiovascular health. So right, you change one thing and the whole system shifts. It's the same if you quit smoking or if you're sedentary and you start to exercise, you sleep better, all these your cardiovascular fitness improves, you get some cognitive stimulus, all these kind of things happen together. So thinking about it as this interconnected network then allows us to say, well, if I change this one thing, a whole bunch of stuff shifts in my favor.
So kind of picking the thing that you feel like, hey, that's going to amplify every other bucket as well too, and have downstream effects there.
Yeah, exactly.
Real quick, I know this will be the last question, because I know we need to hop off. In terms of like nutrients and stuff like that, hot topic is like creatine and ketones. Would those be any, like, obviously those I already know they're going to fall way lower on the list, but just in terms of what does that kind of look like?
Do you know what I talked about outside of the nutrients and like supplementing nutrients if you need it? I talked about one supplement in the book, and that's creatine. And I don't think that everybody needs to take creatine, but it's really low risk with high potential for benefit, particularly if people are thinking about their brains. You know, if you have more creatine on board, if you get a head injury, that seems to maybe decrease the long-term risk or the effects of that head injury. It seems to offset some of the negative impacts of sleep on cognitive function. It seems to improve mood in those who maybe have some depressive symptoms that aren't resolved with other interventions like therapy or drugs. And particularly as you get older, it seems to improve memory in particular. There are now meta-analyses that show that in older adults, especially if cognitive function has started to decline a little bit, creatine seems to improve memory in particular. So I think it's often something that's worth trying. I don't think it's magic like creatine for physical performance. It helps you do work, right? So creatine helps you do more work, and I would say the same thing with the brain. It's going to like help you benefit from the things that you're going to do to challenge or stimulate your brain. Ketones, again, are super interesting. They've been, I've done some work with ketones. We study ketones as a therapy for brain injury in my lab, and they're super promising, but just haven't really seen the study that kind of like makes them the thing that the people should be regularly relying on. In those who already have some cognitive decline or maybe early Alzheimer's, ketone supplements, or they've used MCT oil to generate ketones in some studies seems to improve some aspects of cognitive function. When you have say Alzheimer's disease, one of the things that you see is less glucose uptake into the brain. So, having ketones as an energy source may overcome some of that. Ketones may be protective after traumatic brain injuries or strokes. I think there's a lot that we still need to figure out in terms of what's the type of ketone ester, a ketone salt, the dose, the exact use case. So I'm a little bit more cautious on recommending ketones, but I think they're super promising. And, the work that I think will be done to show that there are certain scenarios where they can be beneficial, I think it's coming. We're just not quite there yet.
Yeah, and they're expensive.
And they're expensive.
Basically, the opposite of creatine. So cool. All right, Tommy. Well, really appreciate your time, man. This was super interesting. I guess a couple things before you go. Anything coming out on your end? I know, obviously, the book, and then anything else, and then where can people find you?
Great. Yeah, thanks. So the book is called The Stimulated Mind. You can go to thestimulatedmind.com and pre-order it. If anybody's interested in it, I have to put in a plug for the pre-order because that definitely helps, Amazon and people know that there's some interest in the book. Then if you do pre-order the book and you sign up for my free Substack, you can sign up for the free version, which is Better Brain Fitness. You can go to betterbrain.fitness and just send me a message and say, "Hey, Tommy, I pre-ordered your book." Then there'll be some goodies that I'll send to people who, for free who pre-ordered the book. So that's another place you can find me, betterbrain.fitness. I have a podcast that I do on there with my friend Josh Turknet, who's a neurologist, and we answer questions. So if people have any questions about any of the stuff we talked about, we answer questions on that podcast, so you can do that there. And then finally, all of this stuff kind of gets linked to, as well as podcasts and other things that I do on my Instagram, which is at Dr. Tommy Wood. So those three areas, and you're in pretty good shape.
Awesome. Cool, Tommy. Well, again, really appreciate your time, man. And we'll chat with you again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really great.